7:41, coming up towards 7:42 in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, let's give some context to this developing discussion that's happening in neighboring Guyana, because as you would be aware, over the last few years, Guyana, having discovered oil and natural gas resources offshore primarily, at least at this time, it has resulted in a surge of economic activity, lots of business activity, and with that, resources and revenue, and the management of that. And of course, we can certainly identify with challenges of that and the mismanagement of resources and the benefits, whether they actually go to the population of the wider society, or are they really closeted for a select few, depending on political loyalties and so on. So we're going to talk a bit about the Natural Resources Fund and Local Content Bill, and we hope to be joined in a short while by Member of Parliament and Senior Minister in the Office of the President of Guyana, and he is Dr. Ashni Singh, with responsibility for finance. He has tremendous experience in areas of accounting and finance. He's a Doctor of Philosophy in Accounting and Finance from the University of Lancaster in the United Kingdom. But while we await for him to join us, let's give you some... In fact, I think he's ready for us right now. Dr. Singh, Minister, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Morning, Fazeer. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for inviting me on your program.
Good to have you with us, sir. And in the limited time that we have available, obviously we're not going to be able to go into great detail over this proposed legislation, but just give us some understanding for our audience here in Trinidad and Tobago, and there's a significant Guyanese population right here in Trinidad and Tobago as well. What makes this legislation so much better than the one that it hopes to succeed?
Sure. So I assume here you're speaking about the Natural Resource Fund Bill.
Correct.
Very good. So before I get into that question, I just wanted, by way of one very brief introductory remark, I just wanted to say that today's sitting in Parliament in Guyana is going to be a very historic sitting, because we actually have two extremely important pieces of legislation going to Parliament. The first is the Local Content Bill, which is itself an extremely important law. And I'd be happy to come back to speak about the Local Content Bill and what it seeks to achieve and why it's so important, if time permits us. But if I were to go to the other and equally important piece of legislation, we're taking to Parliament a revamped Natural Resource Fund Bill, which is a bill that establishes the Natural Resource Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Guyana, sets out the framework under which this fund is going to be subject to good governance, transparency, strong oversight, sets out the arrangements that will govern the relationship between the fund and the budget, and the arrangements for accumulation of savings within the fund, addresses questions in relation to publication and accountability, and like I said earlier, transparency, and overall establishes a very strong framework for managing resource revenue in Guyana, and petroleum revenue in particular. You asked the question about why or how this bill is superior to the previous act that is in place. And let me make the following points very quickly. The first is that the existing Natural Resource Fund Act, which was taken through Parliament by our predecessors, the APNU-AFC government, was taken through Parliament at a time after the no confidence motion had already been approved in our Parliament. Your listeners and viewers would know that in December 2018, the APNU-AFC government lost a no confidence motion, and their defeat in this no confidence motion should have triggered a sequence of events comprising, in the first instance, resignation of their cabinet, dissolution of the parliament, and the calling of elections within 90 days. That sequence of events did not occur because they refused to respect the Constitution, and they refused to respect the no confidence the approval of the no confidence motion. And instead of respecting the no confidence motion and respecting the Constitution, they pushed through Parliament a Natural Resource Fund Act. And considering the importance of this act, It was completely unacceptable that they even attempted to secure approval of such an important piece of legislation at a time when they had lost their legitimacy and their constitutional standing as a government. So to begin with, the existing NRF Act is fundamentally and fatally defective, given the fact that it was pushed through Parliament at a time when Parliament should have been dissolved. So
I hear you on that point, Minister, and I fully appreciate that there are broader issues politically that are tied into it. But if you would allow me to ask what many would consider the fundamental question, even for us here in Trinidad and Tobago, you could put everything on paper, you could put all the legislation, all the proper structures, you could take best practice from other jurisdictions, you could note worst practice in other jurisdictions to try to avoid it. But are you satisfied, sir, that the personalities who will occupy those positions or make the decisions or choose to look the other way are sufficiently people of integrity who will ensure that the people of Guyana are the ones who benefit from these resources?
Well, Fazeer, in fact, this is precisely why we had to take new legislation to Parliament. Because apart from the constitutional defect that their act had, there were a number of fundamental flaws within their act, and I want to address a few of these. First of all, their act had no governance structure whatsoever. So instead of having a board of directors or a governing council or a governing board overseeing the management, they instead had the Minister of Finance with tremendous overreach of authority. And in their formulation, the Minister of Finance had ultimate authority to exercise jurisdiction over the overall management of the fund, to make all of the critical decisions in relation to the fund, to determine the amount to be transferred from the fund, to appoint all of the critical personnel, to appoint all of the critical committees, etc. And there was no board of directors. So to come back to your first question, that was one of the biggest defects that we sought to address. We sought to reduce the powers of the Minister of Finance significantly, and we had promised this in the run-up to the elections. We have drastically reduced the powers of the minister. We have caused the minister to step back. And we have introduced for the first time in the legislation a board of directors. So to begin with, we've introduced a governance architecture that did not exist before. So that's the first important, and we define in the law who should be the board of directors. The board of directors should include representation from the private sector, should include a nominee of the National Assembly of the Parliament, etc. Should be persons with, we specify minimum qualifications and expertise, etc., that the members of the board should have. So that's the first fundamental change that we made. The second fundamental change that we made was in relation to the formula to determine how resources will flow from the fund to the budget. So unlike the Trinidad Heritage and Stabilization Fund, where the resources go to the budget and then get transferred to the fund, all of our resource revenues go to the Natural Resource Fund, and then there's a formula to govern how resources will transfer from the fund to the budget or to the consolidated fund. In their act, there was an extremely complicated and opaque formula that literally nobody could decipher. And in fact, it was designed to obfuscate and obscure and confuse and complicate unnecessarily.
But Minister, if you would allow me, and forgive my rudeness in interrupting you, because time is going by very quickly. And isn't your administration being similarly opaque as far as who is going to select the members of the board of directors who will be managing this entire process? Because I noticed that the President, Dr. Irfan Ali, gave an impassioned presentation yesterday, but still didn't clarify that issue. Is this going to be ultimately about those in the political directorate, the friends and families of government ministers who will make these decisions?
Absolutely not. Let me say, first of all, that it is the president that will be appointing the board of directors, and we are not opaque about that at all. We're completely transparent. We have said that it will be the president who will appoint the board of directors. We've also said what are the minimum qualifications for the board of directors. We've also said that the board of directors must include a representative from the private sector. We've also said that the board of directors must include a nominee of the parliament. So we haven't been opaque at all. The issue that has been raised is, why is the president appointing the board of directors? Well, my response to that is, we have moved from a point where there was no board of directors at all, and where only the minister was exercising all of these functions. We've moved from that point to a point where the president will be appointing the board of directors. We've moved to a point where there is a board of directors, whereas previously there wasn't one. We've moved to a point where the board of directors is not appointed by the minister, the board of directors is appointed by the president. We have moved to a point where there are minimum qualifications attached to the board of directors, and the composition of the board of directors will be published in the official gazette. It's not going to be a secret. The whole world is going to know who the board of directors comprise, or who are the directors on the board, and the whole world will be able to judge whether these are political cronies or these are independent-minded individuals. The composition of the board is not going to be a secret.
Okay, Doctor, I appreciate that, and thanks for the clarification. Okay, let's go with that then. Let's say we know that now. If it is that appointments are being made, and as a final thought, because time is going by, and we really hope to follow up this discussion following the sitting in Parliament and so on. But if it is that a board is named by the president and they turn out to be political cronies, what recourse does the public have?
Well, the public will. Well, Fazeer, this is how democracies work. The public will judge us on the basis. We believe fundamentally. We are a party that believes fundamentally in the ultimate judgment of the people. And so just like with all of the other decisions that we make, we are prepared as a government and as a party to be judged by the decisions that we make and by our performance in government. And so the ultimate test is the judgment of the people, like with all of the other decisions that we're going to make. And so in relation to the composition of the board of directors, in relation to the performance and management of the fund, notwithstanding that we're taking an arm's length, a hands-off approach to the management of the fund, we are appointing, the president is appointing the board of directors, and we are prepared to be judged by the people on the basis of our performance in government. That is how democracies work, and we, more than anything else, subscribe and respect and adhere strongly to how modern democracies function.
And before we conclude, Minister, we really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning to give us a summary of the situation. And because the parliamentary system in Guyana is different to Trinidad and Tobago, where we are first past the post, you have proportional representation, your party enjoys a slim majority in the parliament. Just as a final thought in the 60 seconds that we have, you anticipate that it will pass today?
I'm certainly hopeful that it does, because I will say that bringing the fund into operation, just as is the case with the local content legislation, these are essential elements of the architecture for managing the resources in the petroleum sector. And we would like very much, and I'm hopeful, even if experience teaches me to be has taught me to be maybe a little bit skeptical, I am hopeful that the opposition will come to Parliament today, will recognize the merits of the two bills that we have before them, and I'm hopeful that we'll have smooth passage. That is my expectation and my fervent hope.
Dr. Singh, we want to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Fazeer. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
You're more than welcome. Dr. Ashni Singh, Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back to wrap up the show.